Today, um, we're going to be looking at the story of the resurrection of Jesus. I thought we would do Luke's version. But before I got into that, um, kind of as I put together the Passover Seder for the church and just kind of thinking through the whole Lord's Supper, Passover, Easter service, I started doing a little bit of research about Easter and found it really fascinating. It turns out that most of our evidence for the early Christians that what we're doing today of celebrating Easter on Sunday, it is a would have been an unusual practice amongst the early Christians, believe it or not. So we have evidence in the New Testament that the Christians gathered together on the Lord's Day, is what we find. Paul mentions in First Corinthians that when the Corinthians get together, that they should gather a collection of money to give back to the people in Jerusalem. So we have in places like First Corinthians references to Christians meeting on the Lord's Day. Acts talks about the story of Paul being in Troas with the Christians in a little tiny apartment on the third or fourth story. And he preaches late into the night on the Lord's Day. And that's when Eutychus falls out of the window. So there, I guess long sermons can be life-threatening. So there's a good message there for pastors not to be too long-winded, I think. But Eutychus, whose name means lucky, he's lucky because Paul is around, and on Resurrection Sunday, Paul goes down and raises Eutychus from the dead. So we have that story. And then we have in Revelation, the John of Revelation says that he received his visions on the Lord's Day. So we have three references in the New Testament where Christians are gathering together on Sunday to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on the Lord's Day. So we have that evidence. But what's interesting in terms of what we call Easter, in ancient traditions, Easter is a relatively new term. And if you were to go to other groups like the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, another term for Easter is the Pesach. And that's a Greek term, Pesach, and it comes from the Hebrew Peshach, which that is the Hebrew term for Passover. And if you were to talk to Christians that aren't not part of the English-speaking world, you would discover that they use a different term for Easter. They call it the Pesach. And that term is a reference to Passover, because the early Christians, when they first began celebrating what we call Easter, it was a celebration centered around Passover. Over time, there was a separation from the celebration of Christians celebrating Jesus's life, death, and resurrection over Passover to now where we have this focus where it's really not connected to Passover. It's something where we've moved it to Easter Sunday, which I just found absolutely fascinating. There's the controversy. It's called the Quattrodecimune controversy, and we have evidence. I'm going to read out of a book the sort of people, according to Christian tradition, who celebrated Easter on Passover, what we connect with more of Maundy Thursday. Although Passover is a date, if you look at it, if you talk to a Jewish friend, you'll discover Passover is a day that moves on different days of the week. It's based on the lunar calendar and not a solar calendar. So you have Nisan 15 is the Jewish calendar date. That date moves year to year. And so what happened was early Christians, they would, when they were trying to figure out, well, is it time to celebrate Easter or not, they'd have to go talk to their Jewish friends to find out, well, when is Passover this year? And when they found out when the Passover was, then that set the date for their Easter celebration. And they didn't celebrate it on the day of the resurrection. They celebrated it on the night of the Lord's Supper. And they actually follow, and Good Friday, they follow actually the chronology of the Gospel of John, which says that Jesus celebrated his Lord's Supper and his resurrection on what's called Nisan 14. I'm realizing as I'm talking about this, I probably should make a chart real quick. So excuse me a moment while I make something. All right, so here I've done a share screen where you guys can all see. I've listed Thursday and Friday for you, and I've listed morning and evening for you. I've talked about this before, that for Jewish people, their reckoning of days is from evening to evening, and we see that in the Genesis 1 account when the heavens and earth are created. It's always, and there was evening and morning of the first day. It's backwards for what we tend to think about the day starting at midnight, and we have morning first and then evening and then later. But for a Jewish reckoning of things, the evening is actually the same time, same day as the morning. And so what's weird for us is we celebrate Maundy Thursday, which for us, this is actually a separate day from Good Friday, because we have a little bit different time of how we organize time. But for the Jewish reckoning of things, Maundy Thursday and Jesus's Passover meal was actually on the exact same day as the crucifixion. And so the Lord's Supper and the crucifixion occur from a Jewish mindset on the exact same day. And according to the Gospel of John, this day was Nisan 14. This was what's called the Day of Preparation. This is the day where the Passover lambs have to be prepared. They get sacrificed in order for there to be the actual Passover meal, which would happen on the 15th. So they're actually, what we see and how we celebrate modern Christians today, we celebrate as two different days, Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. For Jesus and disciples, those events occur on the exact same day. And according to the Gospel of John, that day was Nisan 14. And so what early Christians did was they celebrated on Nisan 14. This is when they were celebrating Easter. They celebrated, it was called the Pesach. And so they would have to talk to their Jewish friends about what day they were celebrating. So they weren't, early Christians were not celebrating Easter on Sunday like what we do today. They were celebrating it whenever Nisan 14 occurred, according to the lunar calendar, and they'd have to ask their Jewish friends when that occurred. So I think that's just absolutely fascinating. I'm going to stop the share and just see if anyone has any reactions to this news that Christians were celebrating Easter, and it was focused on primarily the death of Jesus, was part of their early Christian celebration for Easter.
Easter always meant to us beginning Sunday morning.
Right.
So what does Easter mean? What is the meaning of Easter?
So again, for us, Easter, which is a newer English term, is associated with Sunday morning resurrection. And Easter gets established as a Sunday morning festival by the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. So what happens is early Christians, before Christianity is legalized under Constantine, Christians are practicing their celebrating things like the Lord's Supper. They're celebrating, some people are celebrating Christmas, some people are celebrating Easter. And depending on where you're at in the Roman Empire, people are celebrating things differently. And what it turns out is earliest Christians, particularly those associated with Jewish Christianity, were celebrating Easter connected to Passover. And it wasn't until probably 165, AD 165, that Christians began to shift away from celebrating Passover as a celebration of Jesus's death and celebrating that Jesus was the new covenant sacrifice of Passover, to a shift of focus towards the resurrection and linking Easter with their regular practice of Sunday morning worship. So Christians had been celebrating the resurrection all year round. They were celebrating that on the Lord's Day. Christians did that early on, but they didn't make a distinct holiday that celebrated just the resurrection until about 165, and eventually that became the normal practice in 325. There's a shift that happens away from Good Friday towards Easter Sunday, and that shift occurs between 165 and 325 AD. And it's a shift away from Good Friday towards, hey, we've been celebrating the resurrection every day. Let's make Easter about the resurrection of Jesus, not as much about the death of Jesus, which
Is
is
that the same for the Eastern Orthodox, or is that different
so.
for was the
Yeah,
Rome?
that's a great question. So the Eastern Orthodox, they also do the same shift. There is when Christians were first celebrating on Good Friday, what we call Good Friday or Maundy Thursday, um, on Nisan 14, it was Christians all over. And so I'm going to actually read. So here's some of the Christians that according to Christian church tradition, that were celebrating Easter on Good Friday. Um, One of them was Philip the apostle. Another was John the apostle. So that actually this tradition is rooted ultimately in the Gospel of John and John's community in Ephesus. And so Philip and John are the two early apostles, but then we have all these other um, early Christian fathers that we have you wouldn't have heard of, but they were important church fathers. A guy named Polycarp, a guy named Thracius, another named Melito of Sardis, and Polycrates. So there's a whole list of traditions that Eusebius, who's the father of church history, he traces this whole lineage of early Christians into the 2nd century that are celebrating Easter on Good Friday. And what happens is as Christians start to talk with each other about, hey, we do it on Good Friday. Oh, hey, we think we should do it on Sunday. You get Christians coming together and saying, well, which is it? Should we do Good Friday or should we do Sunday for the primary focus of Easter? And there's a conversation that starts to happen that eventually they say, well, we're going to celebrate Easter everywhere. Christians everywhere are going to celebrate it on Sunday. And we're going to make the focus the resurrection of Jesus on Sunday. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Oh.
This is changing the subject a little bit, but if you look up Easter and Astarte on the internet, you'll get dozens of articles showing the pagan, because Astarte was the Greek form of Astaroth, who's a really horrible goddess. What is the relationship there, and why do we use Easter when it's such an obvious connection?
So yeah, the term Easter gets connected to has some pagan connections, particularly amongst Germanic tribes. I think part of what we have to be cautious of is it's called an etymological fallacy, where just because you know the origin of a term doesn't mean that that's what the term means. And so what happens as Christianity moves up into the Germanic speaking regions and into the English speaking regions, you have missionaries who are looking for terms to describe Easter in a relatable fashion. And so they that's the term that they use as kind of their missional outreach, just as we use terms today to kind of help explain things. It's also a way of saying, look, pagans, stop celebrating this Easter holiday that you're celebrating. We now have a new Easter holiday. And that stuff, it's a later tradition than the actual origins of Easter. Part of the challenge is that Passover, Jewish Passover and Nisan 14, 15, as well as what we celebrate for Easter, these are all connected around the spring equinox of the shifting from the calendar season. And so even Passover has a connection around this time. And similar to Christmas, Christmas is the winter equinox. These major holidays occur around significant seasonal times of the year. And Jewish people aren't any different with Passover, of having that shift, and it's related to the new moon that happens. And so just because you have similar holidays happening, whether it's pagan or Jewish or Christian, around the same time, doesn't mean that one group is influencing the other. It's just that what happens for Christianity is it starts, Passover is celebrated based on the spring equinox. As Christianity becomes a distinct religion from Judaism, Christians start to distinguish their holidays from Jewish holidays. And so Christians were concerned about celebrating Passover at the same time as Jewish people. And so they made an intentional decision to have a holiday that was different than a Passover holiday. And so they shift from Good Friday to Resurrection Sunday. That was already their own distinct holiday. So this, and that all happens during the springtime.
Thank you.
As well. So part of it with the stories of Easter is it's a story of Christians making the good news message relatable. So we contextualizing that message. So Pastor Glenn's message today and Pastor Eric's message, they contextualize the gospel with the coronavirus and the pandemic and 9/11, and making the gospel message relatable to people. And so early Christians were doing that as well. So they were saying, look, you have this seasonal change where we're entering into the spring season. You worship the sun. Well, let us tell you about the true Son of God. And so it became a way of outreach to people as well. So it's not that Christians created a holiday based on a pagan holiday. It's that Christians took their holidays that they were already celebrating and related them to other pagan practices and said, look at our better holiday, celebrate the true Son, and get rid of we'll still call it the same thing, but let's lay aside your pagan practices for these Christian practices. And let's turn it to a focus on the true Son of God.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyways, that was kind of I thought an interesting, fun event. So thinking about kind of some of the origins of Easter, Christians were celebrating Easter pretty well from the get-go, just because they celebrated Easter, what we would call Easter, as the Lord's Day every day week. I've said this before, that every Sunday is Easter Sunday. And for early Christians, the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus was not something they waited once a year to celebrate. Early Christians celebrated the resurrection of Jesus once a week. For us, 52 weeks a year. And it was a regular ongoing practice to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. What happens is there's a shift, not just to focus on once a week, but to make it a specific festival once a year, which happens in 325. What's sad to me is that you kind of look at the evolution of things, is that the shift, as great as it is to say, let's celebrate Easter as the resurrection of Jesus on Sunday, unfortunately, what's happened now is Christians have forgotten that Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. That's why we go to church on Sunday. And so, whenever you try to create one solution, you end up creating other problems. And so Christians, they had been celebrating Jesus's resurrection 52 weeks a year. And then it turned into, well, we're going to celebrate it once a year. And for most Christians today, we tend to think about celebrating Easter once a year, the resurrection of Jesus once a year, when the gospel traditions tell us we should be celebrating the Lord's resurrection, Easter, 52 weeks in a year. Every Sunday is supposed to be a resurrection Sunday. And it doesn't matter, we celebrate Good Friday once a year over Passover festival. Fantastic. That's a great celebration. Celebrate the resurrection of Jesus once a year. That's great. Let's mark our calendars and seasons with those. But let's not forget the importance of the resurrection that should impact our lives on a weekly basis. We're weekly reminded that Jesus brings life from death, that Jesus conquers the grave, that Jesus conquers sin and death. And that was the day in some ways, Christians could have chosen. The early Jewish community, they celebrated on Sabbath, on Saturdays. And it's interesting because when Christians decided not to celebrate on Sabbath, on Saturdays, they could have celebrated on Good Friday. They could have celebrated on what we call Easter Sunday. But the Christian community, both are significant, but the early Christian community chose to meet on a regular basis on the Lord's Day, on the first day of the week. They chose to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on a regular basis, not just the crucifixion of Jesus. And I think it's important for us to see how important the hope and power of the resurrection was for the Christian community. There were people that needed that. And Pastor Eric talked about this, and comes up in Easter service a lot. Jesus, there's nothing special about Jesus dying for people. It's easy to die on behalf of somebody else. What's impossible for a human is to come back from the dead after dying. And the early Christians make this radical claim, not that Jesus just dies, but that Jesus came back. I'll pull up another passage. Even the claim of dying, dying on behalf of others. Let's see here. I do my screen share. This is probably going to be pretty small. Apologize about that. Whoops. But this is 4th Maccabees. And what's interesting is, and 4th Maccabees is contemporary with, so I'm going to put this so you can see it better. 4th Maccabees, sorry, keeps jumping around when I change screen size. To claim that someone can die as an atoning sacrifice, it's really not a special claim that Jesus says, Christians claim, well, Jesus died for your sins. Jesus atoned for your sins. The author of 4th Maccabees says, there's these Maccabean martyrs that there's a time of great persecution between the times of the Old Testament and New Testament. This Greek general, or Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, he shuts down the temple and sacrificial system. He profanes the altar in Jerusalem. And so in the midst of that great persecution, people have to destroy the law. There is a story of a persecution of a mother and her 7 sons, as well as a priest. And the author of Maccabees describes their death as that Antiochus says, look, eat this piece of pig. If you'll just eat this piece of pig, you're Jewish, so you can't eat pig. But as a sign that you're willing to give up your obedience to the law, eat this pig. And if you do that, I'll make you a leader in my army. You can almost hear like the temptation of Satan with Jesus. Give up obeying God, and I'll let you rule the world. Well, there's a story of Antiochus saying this to these 7 brothers. They refuse, and they die. They get burned alive. And the author of 4th Maccabees makes a commentary about these guys whose strict obedience to the law. What does that mean? What was the significance of that? And they say, through the blood of these devout ones and their deaths are an atoning sacrifice. Divine providence preserved Israel that had been mistreated. So right here, you get the story that these guys that here in Salah, one of the reasons why Israel was preserved through this time of persecution was because these guys, their deaths atoned for other people, which is just a wild way to say it. I'll find the other one. There's 2 references to this in 4th Maccabees. There it is. Oh, that's Jesus. So we'll just do the comparison, right? And so we have Jesus getting described by Paul, whom God put forth as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. The Christian claim that Jesus could die on behalf of other people, it's actually not a new claim. There was an understanding that Jewish people that your death could serve to help other people. We see this in stories where you hear a story of maybe a parent or a friend dying on behalf of other people. So maybe I think of something like Saving Private Ryan, which is a great movie. It's a war movie, but it's also part of me when I watch that kind of war movie, I'm always a bit like, it's a little crazy how many people died to save Private Ryan. Like a lot more people died, like save all the other people, but there's a reason why these guys die on behalf of Saving Private Ryan. And maybe you think of like some of those other kind of rescue movies where people die on behalf of other people. The concept that a person can die on behalf of another person and rescue them is an old concept. And the idea that Jesus could die to rescue other people is an old concept. It's a concept that's been played around with for a while. But what is radical about the Christian claim is not that Jesus died to rescue other people. The radical nature of the Christian claim is that Jesus came back from the dead to rescue other people. That Jesus conquers sin and death. The radical claim of early Christians is this claim of Easter that Jesus came back from the grave. Other people were already making these claims about dying on behalf of other people, calling it an atoning sacrifice, using that exact same language to describe the death of other people, was being used by other people. And the Maccabean brothers, the priestly brothers, they were just humans. They weren't divine. But Christians claim you have the Son of God dying on behalf of all of humanity and being raised and conquering sin and death on behalf of all humanity. So there's this really, what Easter Sunday does, it changes the entire story. This is why the Jewish religious leaders, they don't believe it. They don't believe that Jesus could come back from there. This is why they tell the soldiers, well, tell people that the disciples stole the body. They had an understanding that someone could die on behalf of other people. They had no understanding that someone could be raised from the dead in order to save other people. And this is the radical claim of Jesus. I'll let anyone want to chime in on that this kind of new nature. There's an old part of the story and there's a new part of the story, isn't there? There's a relatability to the story, but there's also something new.
Unmuted.
Oh, yeah. Isn't it also a radical claim? Up until one of the Christian emperors stopped crucifixion, isn't it also radical to worship a God that died on a cross? Got executed.
Right. People can kill a god, right?
Yeah. So and Christians get made fun of. We have Pliny the Younger who writes talking about this sort of stuff, and you got Tacitus. There's going to be a few people that are going to make fun of Christians for this absurd claim. Why would you worship someone who Rome killed? The whole point of crucifixion for the Roman Empire is to say, don't mess with Rome. This is what we do to humiliate and destroy our enemies. We publicly shame them. And Jesus was publicly shamed by Rome. He was killed. He was tortured. He was stripped naked, and he died on the cross. And the Roman army said, "Yeah, why would you worship someone who died?" Yeah.
Isn't that the background to Jesus is foolishness to the Greeks and stumbling block to the Jews?
Yeah, that would have been part of the foolishness claims. Yeah, absolutely. And you see this if you look at Acts, I think it's 18 or 19, when Paul goes to the Acropolis and speaks to the Athenian philosophers on Mars Hill. They follow along up until the point of the resurrection. That's the point where they lose him. They think this is ridiculous. You're crazy. We can't believe in this sort of savior. When Paul gets to the death and resurrection of Jesus, that's where they lose it. It's foolishness to them. It makes no sense. Yeah. Anyone else?
The Muslim terrorists today think they're doing that.
Yeah.
They're dying to promote Allah.
So part of the story with Easter and the resurrection is that there's a relatability to it. There's a point of connection. So for Paul and the early Jewish Christians, Peter, James, John, to be able to talk to their fellow Jews to say Jesus died as an atoning sacrifice for your sins, that was something that was a point of connection for them. It wasn't so radical that they were like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. People don't do that." It was a point of bridge building. And part of the example of Jesus's atoning death is an example for us to be looking for points of connection with people in our community, in our own lives? What are the parts that is language that makes sense, that we can make points of connection with, that we can then build off of in order to lead people to Christ? And this atoning sacrifice, it's a point of connection. It's not left there. Jesus is more than someone who dies on one person who dies on behalf of a nation. He is the Son of God who dies for everybody. He doesn't die just to save Israel, which is the point of the Maccabean stories. He dies for the whole world. But it's more than that. You can't leave it there. We move on to the resurrection, that Jesus conquers sin and death and changes the story, and that we start to lead people forward. And that's part of the story of Easter, is a challenge for us of how do we find points of connection with people, but then how do we bridge build beyond those to tell what's wonderful about the story of Jesus, the hope that Jesus brings. So I want to look at Luke 24, the story of the first resurrection appearances. So here we've got, hopefully on the left side of your screen, you're able to see this. Says, on the first day of the week, early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking spices that had been prepared. Now, we're going to find out in a minute. I've highlighted down here that it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women with them. There's a group of women that are going to go to this tomb on the first day of the week. This is the text. All four Gospels agree that Jesus was raised on the first day of the week, and that they go early in the morning. So some Christian traditions will have their sunrise services. I am not a morning person. I have only done like one sunrise service my whole life. I'm not a good enough Christian to celebrate Easter this way, but maybe when I had younger kids, when my kids were babies, I guess they woke me up at sunrise. Thankfully, I'm so glad my kids are old enough now. I don't get woken up when the light comes out. But here are these women, it's early in the day. It's their first opportunity to come see Jesus. The Sabbath has been over, and so they're finally able to come and to be with Jesus. And so they come early in the morning, as soon as possible. They couldn't go the night before, which actually was when the Sabbath was over, because it was dark. They come early in the morning in order to come. And they come bringing spices. This shows that the women, they show up, but they have absolutely no belief whatsoever that Jesus is coming back from the dead. Jesus 3 times has told his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, but I'm also coming back from the dead. Repeatedly, he told them that. But it was so inconceivable that someone would actually come back from the dead that it just wasn't even on their radar. There was no map for this. And so they come, they're coming to pay tribute to Jesus, to pay respects to Jesus. He was a great teacher in their mind, but his life had come to a tragic end. That the Romans had won, that the religious leaders had won, that they were going to have to pick up the pieces and to start their life new. But in order to pick up the pieces and start life new, they first had to grieve and to bury Jesus before they could move on, to move in a new direction. They went to the tomb with the attitude of closure. How do we close this thing out? And what's surprising is the moment where these women go to close the chapter on the story of Jesus. This is where the story of Jesus and the story of the church, the book opens up. It's not the last day of the week. It's the first day of the week. Sabbath was a celebration, a remembrance of the first day of the first order of creation. It was a way of looking back at what God had done in the world in the past. He'd made the world good. To rest as God rested at the end of that order of creation. For Christians, Sunday as the first day of the week is meant to be a celebration of the first day of the new creation. And we're called to look for the possibilities. What's God going to do over the next 6 days? What does new creation look like? That we have a new life, a new heavens and earth that are coming, where God's going to say things are good once again. We see that new heaven, new earth in Revelation. But this meant to show us that we're starting something new. They come thinking that things are closed out, and they discover things are going to be opened up for them. It's not the disciples who show up. It's the ladies who are going to show up, and a group of them apparently. Not all of them are named. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women with them. So you can imagine this group of women who were going to this place to pay tribute to Jesus, to give him a proper burial. The Roman armies are gone. The soldiers are gone. They're there to bury Jesus. This burial site was not very far away from the crucifixion site. It's only a 50 feet, maybe 100 yards. Depends on which tomb you go to. They're very close together, that where people were crucified and where the burial site shows up. And they go expecting to bury Jesus. And when they get there, they discover that the stone has been rolled away. They would have put a stone over the tomb in order to seal up the body. I think I've got a picture here of the two different sites that we have. Yep. So I'll share with you. Here's a couple pictures of the tomb sites. You get on the left side of your screen, this is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is most likely what these tombs would have looked like. On the right side is the Protestant site of the Garden Tomb, where you get another side and you've got a little track where the round stone would have been rolled away. But these are examples of burial sites from people in the first century. So they go expecting to go in and bury Jesus. The other gospel accounts tell us the stone was put there by the religious leaders because they want to make sure the disciples don't steal the body. From Matthew, we learn that there's soldiers that were guarding the tomb. And so we discover that it's been rolled away. A mystery has been created. When they went in, they didn't find a body. And this is the point where the shock begins. What you can imagine, they've gone to the tomb to bury Jesus. They get there. First, they're shocked because it's not what they expected. The stone's been rolled away. They would have seen soldiers paralyzed on the ground. And then they go inside and the body's gone. Now, in their mind, someone's stolen the body. What's going on? Someone's further shaming Jesus. And this isn't this isn't something that would have been so out of mind. Jesus had already been publicly humiliated with the cross. Why not further humiliate Jesus and his disciples by stealing the body, by dragging it through the streets, by posting it someplace shamefully? There's no reason that someone couldn't have done something more to Jesus's body to publicly humiliate Jesus and his disciples. Those would have been their first thoughts. They wouldn't have been thinking he's alive. They would think, what's the next shoe to drop for us? They go inside. Luke says they were perplexed. And suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. Now they go in, they look. Of course they're terrified. There's angels that have showed up. This is not what they had expected. We haven't seen angels since the beginning of Luke's gospel. We don't see angels in the story except for the birth of Jesus. Now at the resurrection, angels appear. 2 men in dazzling clothes appear. The women were terrified. They bow their heads to the ground. This is the normal reaction to an angel. You see an angel, you freak out. Then say, why are you looking for the living among the dead? And here it is. He is not here. He has risen. The first proclamation of the resurrection by these 2 angels. There's probably 2 angels here based on Deuteronomy's testimony that you need for a witness court case. It's based on the testimony of at least 2 witnesses. And so you have 2 angels showing up, 2 witnesses that Jesus is not here. He's alive. And they tell these women he's alive. And then remember what he told you when he was in Galilee. Very succinctly, the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and raised on the 3rd day. This is the message. Ever since Peter had said, Jesus, you're the Christ, the Son of God. 3 times Jesus has said, Son of Man must be handed over to sinners, crucified, and rise on the 3rd day. And they remind them of that. Remember, this is what he promised you. And then Luke says, and then they remembered his words. This point of revelation, this good news message given to these women by angelic messengers. Think about all the ways that God could have delivered this news. There's so many ways that this could have happened. There's no reason that the angels couldn't have appeared to the 11 disciples. There's no reason that Jesus couldn't have first appeared to the disciples. There's no reason that Jesus couldn't have appeared in the tomb and just been sitting there and say, hey guys, I've been waiting around for you to show up. There's so many different ways, endless possibilities of how these things could have appeared. But this is the way that's presented for us, that God honors these faithful women who had stood by Jesus at the crucifixion. These are part of the groups of ladies who had been with Jesus while he had died. They'd stood fast by him. During the hard times, they'd been with him. The disciples had fled. But these women had stuck by Jesus, even during the difficult times. Part of these women, these are the women who helped support Jesus and his disciples in the ministry of Jesus. They are the unsung heroes of the gospel story. And here, at the very end of the story, they're brought back into the fore into prominence. Say, God honors them with being the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and other women with them. They got to see the first witnesses of Jesus's resurrection appearance. They get angels that announce it. They get to be the first humans to go back and proclaim to others. Go share this good news. It's interesting in Luke's gospel. Later on in Luke's gospel, he's going to say that Peter also saw him. So here it is in verse 34. Later, it's going to say, this is on the road to Emmaus. They're going to say, the Lord is risen indeed, and he's appeared to Simon Peter. What's interesting in Luke's gospel is there's no account of Jesus appearing to Peter. It just says it after the fact. Instead, Jesus's first appearances are to what we would call in storytelling minor characters, insignificant characters. He doesn't appear first to Peter. He's not named to have appeared to Peter or the 11 disciples initially. He appears at first to the minor, to the insignificant characters. Something new is happening. When Jesus says things like the first shall be last and the last shall be first, he meant it. When we look at the resurrection story, we see God appearing and working and giving the good news proclamation to the people that were considered secondary, second class. He appears to women. Women weren't even considered to have testimony that was worthy of appearing in a law court. They weren't worthy witnesses. They weren't reliable witnesses according to the first century people. So part of proof for historicity of resurrection is that these are terrible witnesses to the resurrection because they would not have been believed in the courts. But these are the people that first appear. The people that you haven't really seen in the entire story. Also, these are the ones who are with Jesus in his final hours on his death, and they're with Jesus in the first moments of his new life. And they're the ones tasked to go tell other people. So just a word of encouragement for us as we think about, sometimes we think, well, I'm not that significant. What could God do with me? I think, in the church, it's easy to think of the pastors as the people up front, right? To me, it's interesting with the coronavirus, how it's shaking up our tendencies to think about what is the church, right? And so right now, we still tune in on Sunday mornings to see our pastors perform for us, to perform a sermon for us, to perform a worship service, to perform an invitation for us, which is wonderful that they're providing those services for us to help lead us and guide us during this time. But it's also a wonderful reminder to us that the church is not about the major characters, the major figures of the pastors. I was watching this morning a little bit of the Pope giving his Easter service in St. Peter's. And they've put a few more people in the Easter service to make it a nice service. But again, it's we keep broadcasting all of our major figures as the people that are supposed to be the ones that show us what the church is like. But this time it's a reminder that the church is not about the major figures in our life. It's not about the pastors. It's not about the teachers. Even this class, it's not about me talking right now. The church, the people of God, it's about the body of Christ. It's about us, the minor characters. Most of us aren't going to have our stories written in the annals of history. People, a generation from now, most of the world is not going to remember us. We think about years past. How many of us know the names of the Christians that have come before us, the millions of Christians before us? We don't know their names. We may know a few people, the famous Christians, on Augustine, and Anselm, and Origen, but they're not the ones that carried the church. The church does not survive because of the major characters. The church survives, the church grows because of all the unnamed figures, all the unnamed people, all the people who we might deem as not important, the people like us. And the church will continue on, not because of the success of preachers attracting people to their websites and live streaming. That's not why the church survives. The church survives because of the women who appeared at the empty tomb, and the angels gave them a message that Jesus is alive. The church will continue to survive because of what you and I do to draw closer to Jesus and to draw other people closer to Jesus during this time and in times to come. What's more important than live streaming is, what does our personal relationship look like with Jesus here and now? Are we still going to the garden tomb? Are we still trying to meet Jesus? Are we still looking for Jesus? Even if we don't have hope of resurrection, are we still showing up to where Jesus is supposed to be? Even if we think Jesus is supposed to be dead, that we show up there, and maybe we'll be surprised that Jesus is alive, and maybe we'll be surprised that we have a message to give to other people. Well, I hope it's encouraging to you this Sunday as we continue to be in our various forms of isolation and disconnect, and we're looking for ways to be connecting with each other. This is a great story of Jesus reaching out and connecting with these women and using these women to connect other people with others, and that there's no one that is so insignificant that Jesus does not want to reach out and to meet and to connect with, as what we see with these ladies here. And Jesus uses their witness, their testimony, to begin to be the testimony for Christians. Their proclamation goes off and is brought forth. The disciples, they don't initially believe the women. They think they're crazy. And I think sometimes people think to us that we're crazy for believing in a resurrected Jesus. And in some ways, the story of Luke is a reminder that no matter how much we proclaim Jesus is alive, people aren't going to believe that until they encounter Jesus himself. But it's a two-part process. We have to proclaim that Jesus is alive, and then we have to trust Jesus to show up in people's lives. And I think that's what we've all experienced, is at some point someone told us that Jesus was alive, and we heard the good news message. And through the Holy Spirit, Jesus showed up and became real for us enough that we professed our faith in him and confessed him as our Lord. And so it's our duty, it's our obligation to go about proclaiming the resurrection Jesus, whether people believe us or not, but also trusting that Jesus is going to fulfill his end of things and to show up and to be present with people so that they too can believe it. And the stories, I love Luke's gospel, you have with the road to Emmaus, Jesus shows up, these two guys, Cleopas and this other disciple, they don't even recognize him. And I think that's sometimes Jesus shows up and we don't recognize him. But then by the end of the story, you have Jesus showing up to the disciples, and they know exactly who he is when he appears before the 11. And first they don't believe, then they can't believe, and then they finally believe. It's kind of this process. The disciples won't believe with the women, they can't believe with Cleopas and the other disciple on the Emmaus Road, and then they finally believe, which is pretty cool. And I think we can all kind of think about people who maybe go through this journey. They won't believe. Maybe they can't believe. and then we finally believe. That's not just something for non-Christians. Like we all go through that moment in our own lives. There's points where I just won't believe that God's going to do what He's got next for me. Sometimes I can't believe it's what He wants to do, and then finally He brings me to a point where I can believe.